Picture this. You wake up and every single person around you is locked in, fasting, praying, meditating. They're not doing it so they can post it on Instagram or send vaguely erotic progress pics to the group chat. They're doing it for God. This was medieval Catholicism, and it makes our modern discipline trends of cold plunges and journaling look softer than two-ply. In this video, we're breaking down 3 ways medieval Catholics practice daily discipline and how we might actually learn something from them to save ourselves from our modern soft-serve lifestyle. So let's travel back through the centuries and see how medieval believers stayed locked in way before social media made it cool. We talk a lot about physical discipline these days, how to get jacked, how to build the perfect morning routine, but you never really hear anyone mention moral discipline. For that reason, we're going to start with moral discipline in our examination of medieval Catholicism, because I know a lot of you degenerates could use a heaping helping of it. In the medieval world, discipline meant recognizing that your actions had real consequences, not just in this life, but also in the next. Confession was the main way Catholics reckoned with mortality and the fact that their sins could affect where they ended up after they passed on. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 made annual confession mandatory on Easter, but most medieval people would have confessed more often than that. What's important to know about the medieval view of confession was that they didn't see it as just a box to be checked. Confession in the medieval Catholic mind was a powerful, soul-cleansing act of honesty and spiritual accountability. Lay people took this sacrament very seriously and approached it with a mix of duty, devotion, and fear. The 14th century Lay Folks Catechism told Catholics to confess not just the sin, but also the time, place, and all the circumstances around it, which forced real self-examination, not just rattling off a vague list of everything you think you did wrong. Now, some people might have seen confession as just another part of their religious duty, but others took it seriously as an act of real moral discipline. The 15th century mystic Margery Kempe recorded in her autobiography how she would sometimes confess multiple times in one day, unable to bear the thought of even a single sin not being brought out into the light. Daily confession is extreme, but it shows how seriously some Catholics took the sacrament as a real commitment to rigorous honesty, accountability, and continual self-examination. And you'd usually be confessing to the same parish priest every time, so if you kept showing up with the same list of sins, that guy would absolutely know. There were even confession manuals that helped priests assign the right penance for whichever sins you'd committed. Stole some tools, lied under oath, slept with your cousin, we've all been there. But to medieval Catholics, these weren't abstract issues to cringe over. They were serious problems with social and spiritual consequences. They viewed the body and soul as completely intertwined, so sin wasn't just a private matter, it could ripple through a tightly knit village and cause real issues if it went unchecked. Confession did help cleanse your soul for God, and it was obviously spiritually beneficial, but it was also a public act that reinforced trust and accountability in the community. If your neighbor saw you going in and out of the confession booth regularly, they knew you were at least trying to be part of the moral order. That was important, especially if you were the type of miscreant who regularly caused problems with the local maidens. Medieval religiosity wasn't just about your individual relationship with God, it was about your responsibility to the people around you. In a world where survival often depended on cooperation, being seen as trustworthy wasn't optional, and sacraments like confession made you at least look like an upstanding member of the community. Compare that to now, where social responsibility has practically evaporated and you can live your whole life without ever having to admit you were wrong to anyone. In our isolated, hyper-individualized world, confession sometimes feels like a relic of a bygone era. But back in the Middle Ages, it was a central act of moral discipline that helped bind the social fabric together. Now for the part you've all been waiting for, physical discipline. And yes, medieval Catholic physical discipline was super metal, and we don't have to shy away from how cool the aesthetics are, even though the actual practices might have sometimes gone too far. In the Middle Ages, Catholics saw disciplining the body as a way to elevate the soul, pushing yourself away from worldly desires to focus entirely on the will of God. That meant everything from fasting and abstinence to hair shirts and self-flagellation. A good place to start when discussing this kind of physical asceticism is the monastic rules of the High and Late Middle Ages. The Ancrene Wisse from 13th century England was a guidance manual for female Anchoresses that gives us rich descriptions of how Catholicism viewed denial of the body. An Anchoress was a woman who chose to withdraw permanently from the world to live a life of extreme prayer, solitude, and discipline, usually walled into a small cell attached to the side of a church. There were male versions too, and they were called anchorites. Anyway, this guidance manual for Anchoresses famously distinguished between the inner rule of the heart and the outer rule of the body. Anchoresses were told that external practices like fasting, keeping vigil, enduring cold, and wearing an uncomfortable shirt made out of animal hair were deeply useful to the inner spiritual life. Physical acts of discipline like these were usually tailored to your individual strengths. Fasting and other acts of denial would be lightened if you were sick or weak, and the guide mentions that not all can or ought to keep the outward rule in the same way. So, contrary to what we might believe, medieval Catholics weren't crazy people who starved themselves to death in the name of God. They believed in moderation, and they recognized that physical discipline could go too far when it was left unchecked. The austerity of the monastic lifestyle was popular among Catholic lay people out in the world. Noble men and women, for example, would sometimes adopt penitential garb or routines in imitation of the monastics to try and reach the same level of spiritual purity. Imagine that, in the Middle Ages, Catholic practices were actually trendy. Saint Margaret of Scotland, an English-born queen who's still revered to this day for her personal piety, was described by her biographer as so dedicated to self-denial in the name of godliness that her fasting brought about a grave infirmity and had to be reeled in to keep her sane and healthy. The French king Louis IX would wear a hair shirt under his royal clothes and observed multiple Lenten-style fasts and abstinence from worldly pleasures as part of what he saw as his holy royal duty. I mention these examples to illustrate that physical discipline wasn't just for monks, and medieval Catholics often went to what we would see as extreme lengths to discipline their bodies and strengthen their souls. These kinds of practices were an integral part of the fabric of medieval devotion, and while maybe we don't need to take it quite as far as they did, it's important for us to keep in mind that we don't have to cave into every single physical impulse we have. Striving to moderate our lives, even in small ways, could be the first step to becoming more spiritually connected. For our last type of medieval Catholic discipline, we're going to return to that concept of community that so many of us are sorely missing. More and more of our lives seem to be happening online, and with AI getting its hooks into everything, it feels inevitable that soon our existence will be mostly digital. While it's definitely possible to find community on the internet, I can guarantee you that the socializing you do on your Discord server is nothing compared to the social life in a medieval village. Medieval Catholics experienced the rhythms of sacramental life as a community. They went to Mass together, they prayed together, they took communion together, they fasted together and celebrated feast days together. Discipline is never easy, but it's definitely a bit easier to stick to when everyone around you is doing the same thing. We've talked a bit about fasting as a practice of individual physical discipline, but fasting days were also an important part of what it meant to worship together as a community. The medieval liturgical calendar was absolutely stuffed, no pun intended, with fasting days like Advent, Lent, the Ember Days, vigils of major feasts, rogation days, and then Fridays year-round. Everyone, whether you were a peasant or a noble or a king, was expected to participate in these fasts, and even though most people weren't literate, they would know about upcoming fast days not by looking at a calendar, but by the social and agricultural markers. Entire villages shifted their meal routines, cooking practices, and trade patterns to align with feast days, and the French medieval historian Jean-Baptiste Molin noted that fasting days were so numerous that the majority of the medieval year was spent either in preparation for feasting or in recovery from fasting. Fasting didn't always mean abstaining from food entirely, and some forms of fasting meant not eating certain rich ingredients or avoiding things that were seen as indicative of overindulgence. Cooks in medieval towns would prepare special fasting dishes like pottage without lard or ale instead of milk to align with whatever the rules were for the current fast. I don't know about you, but if I had a spoonful of pottage and there was no lard in it, I would start throwing hands with the chef, which goes to show how far we've strayed from medieval discipline. Again, even the substituting of ingredients was a communal practice. Whole villages might smell of onions, herbs, and boiling fish on Wednesdays and Fridays when special dietary guidelines were in place. As you can imagine, abstaining as a group created a sense of shared hardship that bonded people together. The upcoming fast might be a topic of conversation around the table at the local inn, or you might pass a neighbor on the street during a fasting time and sympathize a little with each other. Children learned the rhythms of fasting by watching their elders, pilgrims fasted on the road, and the hungry poor were more likely to be fed during Lent than any other time. We tend to shy away from community and communal discipline these days, which is an unfortunate byproduct of modern convenience and the fact that we're able to feel so connected without actually being connected. Maybe the secret to maintaining discipline isn't a more rigid morning routine, it's surrounding yourself with people who have the same goals as you and are willing to work together to achieve them. Accountability and shared hardship are powerful tools. So were medieval Catholics actually more disciplined than us? The answer is a resounding yes, although it's important to remember the historical context of their behavior instead of simply comparing the past and present. People in the Middle Ages lived in a reality where death was constantly around the corner. You could cut your finger repairing something in your house and be dead within a week, or get kicked by a mule and die before you even knew you'd been hit. Because of this, a deep sense of spirituality and a humble approach to religious practice was more natural for them than it can be for us. Discipline is difficult, and it's a muscle that needs to be constantly trained, otherwise it will weaken and become completely useless. Whether consciously or subconsciously, medieval Catholics understood this idea, and the continual practice of rigorous discipline was a key component of the everyday fabric of their lives. Now, does this mean we need to start wearing hair shirts and going to confession every single day? No, but it's a nice reminder that reaching a higher level of discipline is always theoretically possible, and you can train yourself to be more locked in by changing your surroundings and staying consistent with even the smallest good habits. Do you think medieval discipline has a place in our modern lives, or is it an outdated relic of the past? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm John, this has been Medieval Mindset, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.